Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Simon, for those kind words. Thank you, Trevor. Thank you also to Sarah Costigan, who was also very much involved in putting together this exhibition and in the promotion of it. And thanks too to Jessie Carley, who has been badgering me for materials in advance of this lecture. I am perhaps one of the few speakers as part of this Dublin lecture series who has the advantage of knowing that if I lose my train of thought, I can just glance at the wall for a prompt or for a piece of text to carry the momentum forward again. The pivot around which this lecture is going to be based is a decade which was in many ways a defining one for Irish sport. It sees the beginning of Irish state funding for the national governing bodies of the various sporting organisations in Ireland. It sees a revamp in health policy which tilts it towards preventative medicine, and sport is part of a new programme which emphasises health education and health promotion. It sees the development and the publication of the very first policy on youth and sport in Ireland, and out of that we see the establishment of an organisation like COSPOR, which promoted the forerunner of Sport Ireland, our Sports Council, then Sport Ireland, and part of its mission was to promote an ethos of sport for all, which was already commonplace in other countries at that time. And that emphasis on sport for all was encapsulated in an advertisement campaign which ran on television at the time, which asked Ireland to come out to play, because you don't have to be great for international fortune and fame, because sport is for all and doing is the name of the game. That was the ad that ran in Irish and English throughout the 1970s. A decade which also saw Ireland join the EEC, and through that we see Irish government involved in various policy networks, one of which focused on sport and one of which started looking at issues like the role of women in sport. Now, each and every one of these issues is important in and of itself, and yet none of them register in the public imagination when we think of the 1970s. That's perhaps not surprising. The popular sporting consciousness doesn't tend to be excited or moved by policy papers, by policy initiatives, however worthy they are. Kevin Heffernan and the Dublin team of the 1970s are a completely different matter. When Kevin Heffernan died in 2013, there was a frenzy of nostalgia on the broadcast media and in the newspapers. His funeral was broadcast live on the RTE News Now channel, the 24-hour news channel, as was his Kerry the Kerry footballer, Paddy O'Shea, who died in and around the same time. Heffernan was, as many people in this room might know, he was a brilliant hurler and footballer in his own right. He won many county titles with his St Vincent's club. He won an All-Ireland, captained Dublin to an All-Ireland in 1958. He was recognised in the GAA's Team of the Century and the GAA's Team of the Millennium. But it is for his role in stewarding the rise of Dublin football in the 1970s and the early 1980s that he is best remembered and most revered. And that's not surprising in many ways. It was a remarkable achievement for two principal reasons. Firstly, for the alacrity with which it was achieved, and secondly, for the scale of the achievement. Prior to the 1970s, success for Dublin in Gaelic football or in hurling was sporadic at best. From the mid-1920s on, when Dublin GAA had to fall back on its own resources and was no longer reliant on migrants into the city to fill out its county teams, the success of Dublin at inter-county level just fell off a cliff. They won 3 All-Irelands of Gaelic football in that 50-year period from the mid-1920s to the 1950s, and they were won in 3 separate decades. There was no sustained period of success. Then, in the 1970s, you have 3 All-Irelands won in 4 years. You have every All-Ireland final contested between 1974 and 1979, 3 more All-Irelands contested in the 1980s, and a further All-Ireland added to that number. That is quite the transformation. And many of the players who filled those Dublin teams were really unlikely mould breakers. You think of people like Jimmy Keaveney, Robbie Callagher, Sean Doherty, David Hickey, Tony Hanahu, all names that became household in the 1970s. Many of them had played on Dublin teams when the trajectory of its fortunes were running in the opposite direction. In December in 1972, Dublin were not only beaten, they were hammered by Longford in a National League game at the beginning of a campaign which would see them fall through the trapdoor of Division 1 football in the country. They would be relegated to Division 2, from which they would launch their successful All-Ireland campaign in 1974. The lowly status of Dublin football was such that Jimmy Gray, the Nafina clubman and county board chairman, remarked in the mid-1970s that it was clear that something dramatic would have to be done to jolt Dublin, jolt the city out of the lethargy to which it had quite obviously succumbed. Now, Gray is obviously a very self-effacing man, because he didn't acknowledge his own role in the changes that took place. It was he who appointed Kevin Heffernan, Lorcan Redmond and Donald Colfer as selectors in 1973, and in the process he scrapped this outmoded 5-man selection committee for selecting Dublin teams. In the historiography of the Dublin GAA, this is the moment of its modern resurgence. It is also the beginning of what we may call the cult of the modern manager. By the end of 1974, in newspapers and on the terraces, phrases like Heffo's heroes, like Heffo's army, become commonplace. And they speak to an impact that influenced, that resonated well beyond the sporting sphere. The problem is that when we analyse the impact beyond sport of the Dublin team of the 1970s, some quite remarkable claims are often made on its behalf. One of those, I suppose, is that in connecting with a new generation of urban youth, that the team of the 1970s helped fortify the GAA to meet the subsequent challenge, the subsequent onslaught of a more globalised sporting culture. In 2004, at the beginning of a fascinating interview with Kevin Heffernan in the Irish Times, Tom Humphreys laid out as fact the following equation. No Heffo equals no Dubs, equals no 70s, equals no GAA in the city, equals slow death for the GAA, equals this country being a minor colony of Sky Sports Super Sundayland. Now that is quite the narrative chain of cause and effect. But to the extent it succeeds as an explanation for how the GAA has evolved over the last 40 years, I think it is actually of no more than superficial significance. To narrow the lens on one individual, to narrow the lens on one team, is to ignore such wider factors as population growth, new club development, improved club administration, new ways of thinking about coaching and underage development. To say this is not heresy, to say this is not to diminish the contribution of Heffernan and the team of the 70s. It's merely to demand that we apply maybe a broader interpretive framework when we analyse their impact. And that's really what I want to do here tonight. I want to do it in 3 particular ways. I want to do it firstly by looking at the state of Dublin football prior to the 1970s. What kind of GAA scene existed on the eve of that 70s revolution? Secondly, I want to consider where Heffernan as a coach and trainer sits in the broader history of Gaelic football's development. And thirdly and finally, I want to consider the impact that Dublin's success had in shifting, if it shifted at all, the popular perceptions of the GAA in Dublin. So where did Dublin stand exactly in the 1970s? Well, we know that the county teams were no crowd pullers. We know from plenty of testimony from former players that to declare oneself a Dublin footballer or hurler was more often a source of embarrassment than a badge of pride. But I think it's important to point out that obviously inter-county success is by no means the best or even the most appropriate barometer of the GAA's health in any given county. The reality is that the GAA, in Dublin, even though it enjoyed very little success, even though it had very little spectator appeal, was neither stagnant nor was it in retreat. The middle decades of the 20th century were stained in Ireland by high levels of unemployment, by rampant emigration. In the 1950s alone, 400,000 people left Ireland, and mostly this was a flight from the land. During these decades of the 40s, 50s, 60s, the population of Dublin grows steadily. Not dramatically, not rapidly, but it grows steadily nonetheless. And the GAA responds during these decades, and you see that response in the form of new club development throughout these decades. In 1963, just to gauge the level of change that took place, in 1963, the Dublin County Board undertook a report to look at how it had responded to the changes in the city over the previous 25 years and to assess how successful they had been in popularising the games. The report produced very mixed results. On the one hand, it showed, as any report into the GAA in Dublin would show now, that it has a deep and considerable problem when it comes to organising its club fixtures. On the other hand, it showed a massive increase in the levels of participation, particularly at schools and juvenile levels. To give you an example, in 1938 there were only 29 teams involved in juvenile hurling and football leagues in Dublin. By 1963 this had climbed to 217. Now this growth was driven principally by new club development. And by the early 1960s, the type of clubs that were being developed were clubs of a very different kind. What they were doing was building facilities that enabled them to provide not only for sport, but for a wide array of social activities, building social centres, to create basically a home, not just for the players, but also for the families and for the children, to provide that kind of cradle-to-grave involvement in the GAA. Examples of clubs like this on the south side of the city, I suppose, are Ballybones St Dennis, Kilmcook Crokes, both of which were born out of amalgamations of existing clubs in the mid-1960s, and both of which will become engines of greater participation in the decades that would follow, and become huge community organisations in their own right. Another example on the north side of the city would have been St Vincent's, a club which was founded, Heffernan's club, which was founded in the early 1930s to service the youth in the new public housing schemes of Marino. Heffernan gave an interview in 1967, a year before, just after Vincent's had actually established their current home in Raheny, and just a year before they'd opened up their new facilities, their new clubhouse, which included a bar facilities. And he stressed the importance of development of this kind. He said in that interview, "A complete reconstruction of social activity of an adult nature is required to attract and hold the interest of a number and quality of people required to maintain the GAA's position. This should be broad enough to cater for families, and including the ladies is an important part. It must be stressed for the No Change Brigade that this approach is not a replacement of providing sporting facilities for youth, but rather an aid to achieving that aim." This vision of club life articulated by Heffernan was very much in keeping with the way the GAA was moving in any way. One of the paradoxes of the way the GAA responded to demographic change in Ireland is that it redefined, to secure its sporting future, it redefined itself as something other than a sporting organisation. The GAA that emerges in the late 60s and early 1970s is very much a community organisation. It's looking from the games outwards, not inwards towards the games. The GAA recognised this difficulty at a national level. In the late 1960s, it set up a commission to look at its administrative structures. And what that report found, it was published in 1971, a year when for the first time the population of Ireland was found, more than half of the population of Ireland was found to live in urban areas rather than rural areas. That report found that the GAA was weakest in the areas where the population was growing the most, and it was strongest in the areas where the population was in decline. This created a serious issue, obviously, for the GAA at a policy level. Dublin doesn't feature significantly in that report. There is no chapter devoted to Dublin, not because it's not important enough, but simply because the issue is so big it would have swamped the work of the Commission. What it did do, however, I'm not sure if it's on the wall behind me, it recognised that the position of Dublin is of special importance. Now, this was no more than a statement of the bloody obvious. It was to recognise that the GAA, had it remained wedded to its place in rural Ireland, would have really been on a path to nowhere. So when you think about the way the society was changing, when you think about the challenges the GAA was facing, the arrival of Kevin Heffernan and the Dublin teams in the 1970s was very much an accident of good timing. It was fortuitous that the Dublin team arrived in the 1970s at the very time when the GAA was worried about its future, particularly in Dublin. Now, whatever about driving participation, I'm going to touch on that later. What the breakthrough of Heffernan's team at least did was it infused the GAA into the social and cultural bloodstream of the city. Micheál O'Hare in 1975 kind of caught that sense in an article he wrote in one of the GAA magazines. He wrote that in schools, offices, on sidewalks, people are alive to the fact that the city and county has a team worthy of their respect and their support. If changes in the structure of society were driving changes to the administration of the GAA, what can we say about the state of the games themselves? How did they change, and what impact did Heffernan and his team have on them? Now, anybody who has written on this period has almost certainly used the term Kevin Heffernan and Mick O'Dwyer revolutionised Gaelic football in the 1970s. And they do so for very obvious reasons. It's neat, it's convenient, it's a shorthand device for which to kind of convey the dominance that the two counties had from the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s. It's also factually wrong. In reality, Gaelic football has not developed by revolution, but by a process of ongoing evolution. Since the first rules of the game were laid down by Maurice Davin in 1885, the changes have tended to be gradual rather than rapid, albeit there have been periods of accelerated development. The first period of accelerated development, I think, is the opening decades of the 20th century, when the GAA overhauled the rules of the games. They abolished, if anyone can see the picture behind me, what they did was they revamped the scoring system by abolishing the Australian rules sideposts. They also significantly progressively reduced the size of teams, which fell from 21 aside to 17 aside and eventually to 15 aside. The effect of that was to make the games of hurling and football more open, more free-flowing, more enjoyable to play, more attractive to watch. And those changes to the rules also coincided with new approaches to coaching. In 1914, the great Kerry footballer Dick Fitzgerald, whose name adorns the stadium down in Killarney, published the very first coaching manual on Gaelic football, How to Play Gaelic Football, in which he asserted the primacy of Gaelic football over all other codes, which he felt were artificial. Soccer, by its offside rule, rugby, by playing the ball backwards, and kicking the ball out of play, was somehow artificial, whereas Gaelic football was natural. By the time that book appeared, it was commonplace for teams contesting All-Ireland finals to go into training camps in advance of those big games. And those training camps would be funded by training funds established by the county board, into which local businesses and local clubs would be encouraged to support. The training funds were a key part in engendering a county identity and a county loyalty, and it was not beyond the local press to call out local clubs and local areas if they didn't contribute sufficiently to it. From the 1920s onwards, the intensification of training increases with an expansion of the inter-county game. But the second phase of accelerated development really doesn't come until the 1960s. And it's rooted in a growing awareness, a growing appreciation of physical education and coaching. And it owes much to the contribution of this man on the screen behind me, Joe Lennon, who was an All-Ireland medal winner with Down. He was a PE teacher in Gormanstown. He produced 2 books on coaching and fitness for Gaelic football in the 1960s, the first of which was a product of a thesis that he produced in Loughborough College in the UK. It was published in 1963, and effectively said that all established training techniques for Gaelic football were redundant. They were outdated. They needed to be scrapped. The time-worn methods of preparing Gaelic football teams are suddenly out of date, he wrote. Antiquated. We will need to replace physical training with physical education, and this will entail a high proportion of coaching in the preparation of our teams. This is the logical and obvious line along which the game will improve. Coaching as such has never really been studied or applied in Gaelic football, but once the benefits of coaching are realised, we will wonder why we did not think of it sooner. Lennon's ideas were not universally popular. In fact, a future GAA president once denounced them in public for being tantamount to an encouragement to professionalism, ignoring the fact, I think, that the Central Council of the GAA were contributing funding to the publication of the book. The GAA themselves fully embraced coaching from underage all the way up from the early 1970s onwards. Now, Kevin Heffernan was not central to these developments, but nor did he stand apart from them. In 1962, he appeared in the Gaelin film Pell, which was a coaching film in which 7 players were used to demonstrate the essential skills of the game and how to execute them. He also contributed to a Gormanstown school for coaches in 1974. Late 1974, after winning the All-Ireland, Joe Lennon, as PE instructor, invited him down to give a coaching session down in Gormanstown. Among those who attended was Mick O'Dwyer from Kerry. He didn't go willingly. He was suspicious of anyone from outside Kerry, didn't believe they had anything to contribute to how to their thinking on how Gaelic football should be played. But he was cajoled by Mickey O'Sullivan, captain of the Kerry team at the time, and himself a PE teacher. Now, different accounts have been published as to how that training day went. And to how the actual conversation went between O'Dwyer and O'Sullivan in the car on the way back to Kerry. But the one that seems to have stuck is that O'Dwyer said to him that the only way to compete with Heffernan's team was to match them for fitness. Now, fitness was a key part of the Heffernan coaching philosophy, but it was not the entirety of it. He had a very clear vision of the way he wanted his Dublin team to play, and he had a very clear idea of the type of player he wanted. He didn't just want the best players, he wanted the right type of players, the type of players who would commit fully to the county team. And once he had got 26 of those, he explained in the mid-1970s, he sought to develop them in 3 principal ways. Firstly, to improve their individual skill levels. Secondly, to ensure that they each achieved a maximum fitness. Thirdly, to develop field tactics that made the most of all of these attributes. And this is exactly what he did. Tactically, he fashioned a style of play that utilised the hand pass, that enabled the team to actually transfer the ball quickly, open up spaces and scoring opportunities. It brought a fluidity to the game that was described, that was likened by the writer Ulick O'Connor as like watching soccer in the sky. And O'Connor was not the only one to kind of eulogise the style that Heffernan's team deployed. Indeed, the whole package, when put together, the tactics, the fitness, the flair, the team spirit, had many writers and sportsmen from all different codes gushing in their praise. After winning their 3rd All-Ireland in 4 years in 1977, Con Martin, the former Irish international soccer player, commented that the superfit Dubs have so perfected their own particular style and brought it to such a fine art that they make other teams look not second-rate, but third-rate. Not third-rate, sorry, but fourth-rate. Now, Kerry would not obviously just rebut that, they would trash that analysis in the coming years. Con Martin's comments, I think, are indicative of the deep impression that Heffernan's Dublin made both within and beyond Gaelic games. And it was very much Heffernan's Dublin. The team was very much fashioned in the style of its trainer. And that trainer could be a mess of contradictions. He was very autocratic in his style of management, yet he was also someone who expected his players actually to think for themselves, to speak for themselves, and this to a certain extent would rebound upon him in later years. One of the striking features of the Dublin training regime during those years was the video analysis they undertook, then very new. Heffernan used to get Tiernan McBride, a filmmaker who was the son of the politician Sean McBride and the grandson of Maud Gonne, to film the matches in Croke Park. He would only film half the pitch, and he would analyse where players were actually standing or moving when the ball wasn't in that part of the field. But they would undertake, the team in a small hut in the corner of Parnell Park would undertake a rigorous self-examination of performances there, and people were expected to be brutal in their commentary, both on the game plan, on performances, but also on individual performance. Now, it's perhaps not surprising when you develop those kind of critical faculties that at some point they would be turned back upon yourself. And in 1989, when McGill magazine published a wonderful article by David Walsh, who is probably more famous now for bringing down Lance Armstrong. It was a really lengthy piece he wrote called Return to the Hill. He interviewed most of the Dublin team that had played in the 1970s, and it was quite revealing what they said about Heffernan. There was huge admiration for the man, for his intellect and for his tactical know-how, but his motivational approach was hardly new age. Heffernan was a great motivator, but he motivated through fear, recalled John McCarthy, a view that found an echo in comments of others in the same piece. Some years later, in the mid-2000s, the great stylish Dublin wing forward David Hickey commented that he felt that Heffernan had not only helped but hindered the Dublin team of the 1970s. Hickey remarked, "I think as a team we were never allowed to develop. I would feel that as a player I'd never got the most out of myself, never developed into what I could have, because Kevin had a very clear roles for us, and he set the limits as to what he wanted each player doing." Now, whether the team of the 70s realised their potential or not, I think is really a matter for the players themselves to maybe come to some sort of conclusion of. What is certain, though, is that Heffernan's reputation was not just rooted in the achievements of the 70s, it was rooted in the fact that he actually forged a second All-Ireland winning team with very few of the players of the 1970s. In 1983, Dublin re-emerged after a number of years playing second fiddle in the Leinster Championship to Offaly, not just to win a remarkable All-Ireland final, defeating Cork. I'm not sure if you can see the picture behind me here, was taken down in Porky Queeve the day of the replay. Dublin won that game 4-15 to 2-10, and it wasn't broadcast live. I had to listen to it on a transistor at home beside my father, having been in Croke Park the week before. I was too young, I was told to go down, and of course there was a threat that the Dubs would go on the rampage once they got down to Cork at the time. Dublin won the All-Ireland in 1983, lost two subsequent All-Irelands to Kerry in 1984 and 1985. And the thing about those two finals to Kerry is that it was obviously a renewal of the rivalry of the 1970s, but it was very, very different. For the first part, it was no longer a rivalry of equals, as the Kerry team of the 80s was by far the greatest team we've perhaps ever seen in Gaelic football. Secondly, there was a sense that Gaelic football had begun to lose some of the lustre it had acquired in the 1970s. Where it had once appeared rejuvenated, by the mid-1980s it had appeared jaded. Prior to that 1985 All-Ireland final, one magazine writer wrote a piece headlined "Gaelic Football's Fall from Greatness," and he complained that little had been learned in Gaelic football in the previous 5 years. The innovations were all introduced by Kevin Heffernan and Mick O'Dwyer almost 10 years ago, and nobody seems to have had a new idea since then. Now, this yoking together of the careers of Heffernan and O'Dwyer is, I think, somewhat inevitable, not least because of the dominance of the two teams across that decade. And while I don't think there's any argument but that Mick O'Dwyer was the most successful of the two managers, I think it can also be argued that the most culturally significant was Heffernan. And that significance is rooted, I think, in the impact that team had in connecting with a very new generation of urban youth. Now, when we talk about youth in Ireland, it's not a word that was actually used prior to the 1950s, and its emergence in Irish society is kind of rooted in forces both from without and within the society. It was forged as a result of imported cultural forms, the impact of cinema, the impact of rock and roll, the impact of imported programming on the new Irish television service from 1962 onwards. It's rooted too in an expanding domestic economy, and this idea that actually there is a youth market, there is a youth economy, and businesses began to start pitching at that economy. It's rooted too in an expansion of educational opportunities in the 1950s and 1960s, which means that now for the first time we have a generation which are no longer rushed into adult lives of work and responsibility. By the early 1970s, there's a generation of youth which both has more leisure time and more choice in how to spend that leisure time. Now, what they weren't doing was actually going to sport. They weren't spectating of sport. They weren't attending sport. As we remarked earlier, the Dublin footballers drew only a trickle of a crowd, and the appeal of soccer in the city had fallen off a cliff over the course of the 1960s. Its decline was, there were a number of factors which caused its decline: poor club administration, crumbling facilities, and also, I think you would have to say, the competition from overseas soccer, which was now actually being broadcast through the medium of television into the living rooms of many Irish people. As the Irish Times journalist Paddy Downey put it, the professional glamour of cross-channel soccer captured the imagination and interest of the younger generation more and more, and lacking successful soccer teams of their own to identify with, Shamrock Rovers and the other city clubs were also in decline. The Cop, Old Trafford, Ellen Road and Highbury became, in sporting terms, the spiritual homes of Dublin's youth. Downey's complaint wasn't that there was soccer on TV, but that there was a complete imbalance in the coverage provided. As he more vividly portrayed it, there was glittering substance on one hand and scarcely a shadow on the other. Partly the creation, he wrote, of our mass media was systematically destroying the self-respect of the sports-loving public. Now, if nothing else, Dublin's breakthrough All-Ireland success of 1974 helped correct this imbalance and shore up some of the anxieties that underpinned it. Throughout 1974, as Dublin progressed in that championship, there was a snowballing of support, and what you saw emerge was a fan culture that borrowed liberally from the soccer stadiums of the UK. There's a picture on the wall over here, it's here behind me, of the Guards hoisting players off the Croke Park pitch towards the end of 1974 final. Heffernan was brought onto the field to help the Guards remove the crowds from the pitch. He wrote subsequently of his memory of that day and the impact it made on him. It was personally uncomfortable to be at the centre of it, but it was spectacular. You could feel that you were part of something new and unique. It certainly felt new and unique to Gaelic Games. It was loud, it was colourful, it was noisy, it was vibrant, and it was also, as I've alluded to earlier, somewhat troublesome. A feature of the newspaper coverage across this decade of Dublin inter-county games was that sense that trouble lurked. Now this kind of coverage was completely exaggerated, but it was not without some substance. There was trouble. There was trouble at the 1975 All-Ireland semi-final when Dublin played Derry. The Kerry poet Gabriel Fitzmaurice has wrote beautifully about encountering a mob of Dublin supporters prior to the 1978 All-Ireland final in Croke Park. There was trouble, or anticipated trouble in Cork, which never materialised. Prior to that All-Ireland semi-final in 1983, there was trouble the day of the All-Ireland final of 1983, there was trouble the day of the 1984 All-Ireland semi-final between Dublin and Tyrone. Now, many GAA people sought to distance themselves from what was actually taking place on the terraces, from the reality of the GAA club scene in Dublin. One interviewed by the Irish Independent remarked, "Let's face it, a large proportion of the present Dublin following consists of hooligans, louts and foul-mouthed ruffians who have absolutely no interest in Gaelic football or the GAA. Now, interested or not, GAA members or not, the growing spectator appeal of the GAA was an important development, and Heffernan recognised it as such. To him, it demonstrated the degree to which the Dublin football team had gained acceptance in the city. What's more, he remarked in late 1976, they had to a large degree replaced the names of English soccer stars in the minds of young footballing enthusiasts, and by their example in Irish sporting life, they've contributed to maintaining the national identity in the city. They certainly afforded a greater visibility to the GAA in the city, but the far bigger challenge for the GAA was in translating audience into participants. The team in the 1970s was brought around to schools, and the trophy was brought around to schools to try and mobilise participation, and not without some success. There is a spike in the number of schools participating in competitions in the 1970s. But the principal driver of growth, of change, of development remained the clubs. The 1970s was a period of rapid social transformation in the city. The population tops, in 1981, the population tops 1 million in Dublin for the very first time. And the rate of growth in the 1970s alone was sufficient to see the creation of 57 new Catholic parishes. Now, that would not be a measure of anything today. Back then, it was a fairly good indicator of the rate of change and also the location of the change. New clubs that were created during that period, one of which is thriving today, was St Jude's Club in Temple Oak, which was founded in 1978. Another club was Shankill, which bordered Wicklow. That was founded as a hurling club only, and it set up street leagues, borrowing from the example of Waterford and Cork, trying to promote hurling through various street leagues. The key message to be drawn from all of this is that the GAA would have expanded with or without a Heffernan revolution of the 1970s, and still there were limits to that expansion. The problem for Dublin in the 1970s and 80s then remains as it is today, that it is unequal to the pace of population growth. There are simply too few clubs serving too big a population. In 1987, 2 years after Heffernan stepped down as Dublin manager, a report was delivered to the Dublin Convention. It noted that there was one club for 50,000 people in Clondalkin, one club for 60,000 people in Blanchardstown, and in Tallaght, which had a population of 70,000, which was more than 14 other counties in the country, there were only 3 clubs. Think about that. Think about that. If any county in this country reported back into Croke Park that they had only 3 clubs, we would say that the GAA doesn't exist, or at least was in crisis in that particular county. But that is the reality in large parts of Dublin. These are sobering statistics, and they show that for all the success of the Heffernan era, and for all the glamour and spectator appeal attached to its teams, the GAA did not sweep all before it. Geography was one reason, but I would also argue that issues of class, culture, ideology were also inhibiting factors. These, I think, I think they find expression in 2 particular ways. One is the resilience of established sporting cultures. In 1971, the GAA abolished its ban on GAA members playing foreign games, and there was an expectation within the association that there would this be rush of new recruits into the association. It never materialised, principally because I think the GAA were engaged in an exercise in wishful thinking. To abolish a rule which was in itself prejudicial, exclusionary, and to expect that people who would rush to an organisation when they had no prior experience of it was really expecting too much. It takes no account either of the fact that in many of the large private fee-paying schools that remain closed to Gaelic games, you have to take account of their own deeply entrenched sporting traditions and also to their class and cultural composition. A second reason why I think the GAA failed to expand beyond what it actually did was the spillover effect of the Northern Ireland Troubles. No sooner had the GAA abolished its ban on foreign games than it was plunged into the cultural crossfire of the Northern Ireland Troubles. Now, within Northern Ireland, in those 6 counties, the impact of this was very, very real, and we know all about that. The harassment of members, the occupation of club grounds, the arson attacks on facilities, the murder of GAA members, and recent ombudsman reports from the north in recent years show that they were actually carried out sometimes with the collusion of members of the security forces. These are all very, very real impacts of the Troubles on the GAA. Nothing like that impacts on the GAA outside of Northern Ireland, but the Troubles do shape official attitudes at all levels, mindsets and official attitudes at all levels. On the GAA's own website today, you'll see the association making the rather self-congratulatory claim that its own decisions to abolish the ban on members of the British security forces playing Gaelic games in 2001 and the opening of Croke Park to rugby and soccer in 2005 signalled positive contributions of the association to the emergence of a post-Troubles modern Ireland. What they don't say on the website is that these concessions were granted only after the hard-fought peace had been won. And it might be argued that the logic of their position could actually be turned against them. And that even if the GAA's rules, exclusionary rules, were not a factor in contributing to the Troubles, they may have at least informed the divisive attitudes that underpin them. That's certainly how, rightly or wrongly, they were routinely perceived. A case in point is the response of the Dublin GAA's annual convention in 1983 to reject, by a margin of 173 votes to 41, a motion that might have empowered the GAA's Central Council to open up Croke Park to other sports. It brought down upon the Dublin GAA the wrath of none other than Eamon Dunphy. Writing in McGill magazine, he worked himself into a lather of indignation that would become his journalistic stock in trade. What's more, he linked directly the attitudes paraded at the Dublin GAA convention with the violent atrocities that were then so routinely presented on evening news bulletins. Sports news rarely provokes disgust, a feeling of one's stomach turning, he wrote. These are, after all, only games. But this is sports news with a difference, because in their bigotry and prejudice, the GAA betray many of the symptoms of the cancer that afflicts the wider national spirit, a disease that weekly kills and maims not just occupying troops, but school children, housewives and disco dancing girls. Some unity, some patriotism, some damn country with a national game like that. This was a theme to which Dunphy and others would warn to on not just one occasion. Now, I wouldn't for a minute want to exaggerate the significance of contributions like that, but they do underline a particular point. That while the 70s phenomenon of Kevin Heffernan and the Dubs presented the GAA with a very modern, urban image, one that broke away from a traditional rural self-definition that they had previously had. The continued weddedness of the GAA to its nationalist aspirations, and these are entirely legitimate. And there is, I think, it would have been impossible for the GAA as a 32 county organisation to retain its coherence had it broken away from them. But the fact that it remained wedded to them against a backdrop of violence created difficulties for it. It's hard to remain wedded to a nationalism when that nationalism itself is under scrutiny, when that nationalism itself is undergoing serious revision and his polarising opinion. And what you find in the 1970s, in not just in sport, but in other kind of forms of cultural expression, are actually being quietly ditched in the context of the Troubles. I'm going to finish by just making the following concluding statements. Right? And they are really that the 70s was a remarkable decade. I don't think there's any denying. The 70s was a remarkable decade for the Dublin GAA for reasons not limited to the success of the Dublin footballers. It was a decade where the county experienced significant population growth, and it was the responsiveness of clubs established anew to the demographic development that provided the platform for the GAA's subsequent expansion in the city and county. That said, this Dublin team of the 70s were undoubtedly a special group who achieved levels of success that were unprecedented for a team comprising native Dubliners. Nothing like it had been seen before. In doing so when they did, and in generating media and spectator interest in the way that they did, they initiated the modern phenomenon of the Dubs summer support. And that has been crucial not only to creating the annual spectacle that we see in Croke Park, but also is crucial as a driver of GAA revenues in the last 3 and 4 decades. Finally, in doing so when they did, at a moment when Irish society was in a period of rapid transition at many levels, it ensured that the team, that Heffernan and the team enjoyed a social and cultural impact well beyond the sporting sphere. This is not something that any team, however successful, can bestow upon itself. It is a matter of time and it's a matter of context. And it's for that reason that whenever people talk about the 1970s in Ireland, when everyone sets out the story of Irish sport in the 1970s, they don't talk about those things that I was talking about at the start. They tend to talk about Kevin Heffernan, the Dublin team of the 70s, the Dublin rivalry. It was for that reason, I think, the decade of the Dubs. Thank you very much.